Hi, I'm Jacqui Fashimpaur and I'm a researcher at Reality Labs Research. Today I'll be presenting our work investigating wrist deflection scrolling techniques for extended reality, which is an umbrella term for virtual, augmented, and mixed reality. Heads-up displays, like AR glasses, have the potential to assist with our chores, work, and personal lives by making relevant information instantly accessible. We should be able to provide input to these devices in a way that is similarly low effort and seamless with our other tasks, but this may not be possible with existing technology. Today, the vast majority of XR interactions use either handheld controllers or mid-air gestures detected by hand tracking using cameras in the headset. These techniques present a trade-off between two potential problems. First, if you use controllers, you encumber the user's hands in a way that may not be practical if they need to perform a task with their hands or take their XR device on the go. But if you want to free the user's hands by using mid-air gestures, you constrain their arm posture to somewhere the headset's cameras can see, usually out in front of them. This arm-outstretched pose in particular can be fatiguing and socially undesirable, but every posture is sometimes inaccessible. For example, you may not be able to hold out your arm in a crowd, or point your arm down while seated. The friction introduced by these methods undermines some of the potential value of wearing an always-available display. Imagine instead that you could instantly and subtly interact with virtual interfaces at any time with minimal interruption of your primary task. To realize this vision, there is a need for interaction techniques that are both freehand and independent of arm posture. One promising form of input that would have these properties is wrist deflection, the angle between one's hand and one's forearm. Past research like wrist whirl and rotowrist has shown that optical sensors on a wristband are a practical way to measure wrist deflection without encumbering the user's hands. And because this value is local to the wrist, it should be flexible across arm positions. This makes it an attractive solution for convenient XR input. Our paper investigates wrist deflection applied to scrolling in extended reality. Scrolling is a fundamental interaction primitive that's received little attention in the context of XR. But think about how often you scroll. Whether it's navigating a checklist, a document, a newsfeed, a schedule, or an app menu, there are many day-to-day use cases in which one-dimensional scrolling and selection are the primary method of interaction. So it's a good place to start evaluating this new input modality. We had two high-level research questions. First, is wrist deflection effective for XR scrolling interactions? And second, what is the best design for wrist deflection scrolling? We approached these questions through an in-depth user study examining two proposed wrist deflection scrolling techniques. Both of our techniques use wrist extension and flexion as their primary input, a thumb to forefinger pinch gesture to activate scrolling, and a double pinch to select. The main difference between them is in the way that the wrist angle maps to scroll movement. One technique uses something called rate control, where the user's input dictates the scroll speed like they would with a joystick, and the other uses position control, where the user directly shifts the vertical offset like with a scroll wheel or touchscreen. Let's see them in action. The rate control technique is called wrist joystick. The user pinches and holds to begin scrolling and releases to stop. While scrolling, the angle of their wrist determines the speed at which the content scrolls, with a neutral angle meaning no movement, and more extreme angles causing faster movement in their respective direction. Our position control technique is called wrist drag. The user pinches to grab the content and angles their wrist up and down to conceptually drag the content back and forth. They can drop it by releasing their pinch. If they release while the wrist is moving, they can flick the content and let it travel a greater distance before slowing to a stop with simulated friction. To learn more about these two techniques, we evaluated them in a 24-person user study alongside two state-of-the-art VR scrolling techniques. The first of these is called controller joystick, a rate control technique that uses the deflection of a joystick on a meta-touch controller to determine the rate at which the content scrolls, using the same mapping function that we do with wrist joystick. Then we have arm drag, a position control technique that uses the Quest's default hand tracking raycast to point at the content and drag it when the user pinches, using the same sliding and friction behavior as wrist drag. We selected these techniques not just because they represent very common approaches to scrolling in extended reality, but also because they're close analogs to wrist joystick and wrist drag, respectively. This allowed us to compare not just which techniques performed better, but how users behaved with each one, and to therefore see the impact of wrist deflection in particular. Our study included two different kinds of tasks designed to evoke different scrolling behaviors. The first task was called reciprocal selection, a variant of the Fitz reciprocal tapping task. Participants had to scroll back and forth between two targets in a numbered list as quickly and accurately as possible. For each trial, we varied both the distance and height of the targets for 6 total size distance pairs. Here we're showing the scroll time results for this task. We've split this graph up by the 3 different target distances. As you can see, controller joystick, shown in red, had the fastest completion times, at least at the medium and longest distances, while wrist joystick was consistently the slowest. Arm drag and wrist drag were in the middle and pretty comparable to each other. And that's a really promising result, because it shows wrist drag as competitive in the space of freehand techniques, if not quite at the level of a physical controller. One possible explanation for this performance comes from the user's behavior with arm drag and wrist drag, which was very similar to each other. Quick drag and flick gestures that didn't necessarily take advantage of the additional range of movement supported by arm drag. In contrast, the two joystick techniques had very different user behavior from each other. Participants using wrist joystick smoothly shifted between scroll speeds, gradually accelerating and decelerating. But with controller joystick, they quickly jumped to very high speeds and back again, possibly aided by the physical joystick's elastic recentering. So, to our research questions, these results suggest that, yes, wrist drag could be an effective freehand scrolling technique, and that position control might be a better design for wrist deflection than rate control, at least in this task. But that's not the whole story. While the reciprocal selection task was all about quickly scrolling to a target in a known location, we also wanted to see how the techniques would perform in a situation more like casual browsing, in which the user needs to mentally process the content as they scroll through it. This brings us to the second task in our study, the counting task, in which participants were given a grid of 99 photos from the Oxford IIT PET dataset. I'm just showing a basic grid here, but imagine each cell has a photo in it. Most were pictures of dogs, but there were also some cats randomly mixed in. Participants were asked to scroll to the bottom of the list and count the number of cats as quickly and accurately as possible. Here's how the four techniques performed on the counting task in terms of total scroll time. Once again, the controller joystick did very well, but in a reversal from the previous task, it was not wrist joystick, but wrist drag that performed the worst. It was significantly slower than both joystick techniques. Meanwhile, wrist joystick was competitive with both state-of-the-art techniques, indicating it's a very promising approach for tasks like this. And that's consistent with the user behavior we observed. Participants using either controller joystick or wrist joystick followed basically the same strategy. Find the angle that maps to a suitable scroll speed, then just hold still there while the images go past. Meanwhile, with the two drag techniques, users had to perform repeated dragging movements without the added efficiency of flicking the list. And that's where arm drag's extra input range may have given it an advantage over wrist drag, since each motion with the former could be larger. Then, returning to our research questions, these results indicate that wrist joystick could be an effective scrolling technique. And between the two wrist deflection designs, rate control might be better than position control for this task. Now, you might have noticed at this point that none of our wrist deflection techniques are outperforming the state-of-the-art. That's expected, because their added value is in subtlety, convenience, and flexibility. But for that reason, we wanted to confirm in our study that their good performance wasn't limited to an arm in front posture. So, while all four techniques were evaluated first in a seated position with the user's elbow on an armrest, we also added one block of each task for just the wrist techniques that would be performed in a standing position with the user's arm hanging by their side. And what we found is that the change in posture had no noticeable effect on behavior or performance. If we look at the scroll time graphs from before, next to the arm at side times, we can see that across both tasks, each wrist technique had very similar scroll times before and after the posture change, which is a good sign that they are flexible with respect to arm position. So, for that first research question, is wrist deflection effective for XR scrolling interactions? It looks like the answer is yes. At least in situations requiring freehand interaction, wrist deflection may be a desirable alternative to vision-based hand tracking. In both of our study's tasks, one of the wrist techniques performed comparably to arm drag in an arm in front posture, and both techniques retained their performance in an arm at side posture that arm drag can't support. This added flexibility could be key to enabling quick selections or extended browsing without the social or ergonomic costs associated with mid-air gestures. Our second question, what is the best design for wrist deflection scrolling, is a little more complicated. It looks like context makes a big difference. Each of our proposed techniques was able to perform one task well, with behavior very similar to its state-of-the-art counterpart. But they also each performed relatively poorly on the other task, possibly due to limitations of wrist deflection input. And though I couldn't get into it much here, there also was room for ergonomic improvement of both techniques. I do want to highlight one ergonomic figure, though. These are density plots for each user's 2D wrist angles over time, across all wrist techniques, tasks, and arm postures. As you can see, many participants demonstrated tilted or curved paths instead of just flexion and extension. But what's really interesting is how consistent many of those shapes are across different contexts. This suggests an opportunity for future work to personalize each user's input, to capture a larger and more natural range of wrist angles. Other future work could explore ways to mitigate the issues we observed with each technique, such as increasing wrist drag's input range, adding haptic feedback to wrist joystick, or designing a hybrid rate control, position control technique to capture the best aspects of both. I'd like to thank my co-authors for all their support. There's a lot more analysis that I couldn't cover here, especially about ergonomics, so be sure to check out the paper if you're interested, and reach out if you have any questions. Thank you.